Some stories begin with triumph. Mine began with loss. What was meant to be love turned into abandonment, and what should have been family became betrayal. But from the cold night I was cast aside with nothing but my daughter in my arms, I learned something I hadn't understood before. Survival isn't quiet, it's the seed of transformation. This is not just the story of how I endured, but how I rose, rebuilt, and claimed the life they tried to take from me. My name is Danielle Brooks. A few winters back, I found myself standing in the biting cold with nothing but my baby girl pressed against my chest and a bag of clothes that had been thrown together by people who swore they cared. There were no goodbyes, no reconsiderations, not even the dignity of compassion. For years, I thought strength meant silence, absorbing every insult, forgiving over and over, believing love could fix what was already broken. I used to think if you were patient enough, kind enough, you'd be enough. But that night I learned I was wrong. When they pushed me out, the sky stretched endless and empty. The wind tore through the holes in my socks as I stepped off the porch, holding Naomi, barely 2 months old, in one arm and a duffel I hadn't even packed in the other. It was a little past 2 in the morning. My breath curled into white fog, each exhale louder than the silence that followed me. Terence, her father, didn't say a word when he opened the door. He only stared down at the floor, his jaw tight, his hands shoved in his pockets. His mother, Claudine, stood just behind him, arms crossed, face carrying that mixture of judgment and smug relief. "She'll be better off somewhere stable," Claudine muttered, like I wasn't already cradling the most delicate life in the world. "She's just 2 months old," I whispered, desperate. "She needs both of us. She needs love." Terence's reply was flat, final. "You need to go. It's for the best." And then the door closed. Just like that. No shouting, no tears. Just the quiet end of everything I thought was real. I stood frozen, not only from the cold but from the cruelty of it. The man I loved, the father of my child, had handed me over to the night as though I was disposable. So, I walked. No destination, just away. I ended up in an all-night diner where the waitress didn't ask me to buy anything. She just let me sit in the corner while Naomi slept against me, wrapped in my coat. I stared at the menu like the words could anchor me. By sunrise, I'd scraped enough change together for a room at a rundown motel, number 7. The wallpaper peeled, the heater hissed like it was dying, but it worked. I laid Naomi on the bed, tiny and innocent, her small breaths reminding me that she had no idea what had just happened. She whimpered, and I pulled her close, whispering, "I won't let them define us. Not now, not ever." That night, I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't broken, but because something inside me was waking up. Something buried but fierce. They thought they'd discarded me, but they didn't know who I really was. Not yet. To outsiders, it looked like kindness. A new mother taken in by her partner's family. A grandmother stepping in to help. A safe place to start again. But Claudine's house had never been a home. It was a stage where every glance reminded me of what I supposedly lacked, every whisper another judgment. It started with little corrections. Notes on how to cradle Naomi, reminders of when to feed her, what brand of formula she considered proper. "You're holding her head wrong," she announced on my 3rd day there. "She's restless because she can feel your nerves." Terence would nod quietly beside her. He never raised his voice, never defended me. He just faded, bit by bit, into the background. When I tried to tell him how Claudine's words cut through me, he brushed it aside. "She means well," he'd say. I stopped arguing. The more I pushed back, the further he drifted. So, I adapted. I folded laundry her way. I made bottles the way she instructed. I smiled when I wanted to scream. But inside, I was unraveling. Every step I took in that house felt watched, measured, criticized. If Naomi cried too long, Claudine would sigh, "Maybe you're just not soothing enough." I cried in the shower with the water blasting, biting into a towel so no one could hear. At night, I whispered promises to Naomi, words she couldn't understand but ones I needed to speak aloud. "It won't always be like this. I swear to you, baby, it won't. I told myself staying was better than leaving. That if I endured just a little longer, maybe things would change. But they didn't. Terence grew colder. Claudine grew sharper. And I began to fade, piece by piece. By the time that door slammed shut and they pushed me into the night, I was already halfway gone. But deep down, I knew I would come back to myself. Every part of me they tried to erase, I would reclaim, because even shadows remember the light they once came from. The motel clerk didn't ask a single question. He just slid the key across the counter with a glance that said he'd seen 100 women like me before. Room 108. I signed the slip with trembling hands and shuffled down the hall, Naomi pressed against me, fussing from the chill. The room smelled like damp carpet and old smoke, the buzzing neon light outside flickering through the curtain. It wasn't home, but it locked, and that made it safer than the house we'd left behind. I laid Naomi on the bed, staring at the stained ceiling above us. My body ached in ways I didn't know were possible. I hadn't eaten in more than a day, but none of that mattered. Tonight, survival was enough. The heater sputtered, but I wrapped Naomi in my coat and curled beside her. My eyes burned. My hand trembled. I pressed my forehead to hers and whispered, "You don't know it yet, but you saved me." Sleep never came. I stared at the cracked mirror across the room, barely recognizing the woman reflected back. My hair tangled, skin dull, lips split from the cold. But my eyes, they weren't gone. They were steady, fierce. That was the first time I saw her again, the version of me Claudine had tried to erase. By morning, I scraped together coins from the lining of my purse and bought baby formula, a pack of crackers, and a cheap bottle of water at the corner store. Every dollar spent cut deep, but Naomi smiled in her sleep that night, just the faintest curl of her lips. And that small smile told me this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The motel room became a kind of limbo, a holding place between fear and something I didn't yet have a name for. For 2 days, I rationed crackers, measured scoops of formula, stared at the ceiling like it held an answer. I checked my phone over and over, even though no one called. No messages from Terence. No word from Claudine. Deep down, I knew they wouldn't reach out. Still, some fragile part of me hoped they might realize their mistake. But they didn't. And then I remembered the letter. My father's letter. He'd written it before he passed, tucked away at the bottom of a drawer I hadn't dared open. Inside, a key. A lawyer's name. Mr. Langston. And a note in my father's handwriting. When you're ready to come home, everything you need is waiting. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just picked up the phone and dialed. He answered on the second ring. "Mr. Langston," I said, my voice breaking halfway through. "I'm ready." No lectures. No questions. Only quiet action. That evening, a black car pulled up outside the motel. The driver carried my duffel with silent respect and opened the door. Naomi nestled in my arms. I slid into the back seat. We drove for hours, past city lights that blurred into darkness, into the kind of silence that feels like healing. When the gates opened, my breath caught. The estate stood like something from a dream I'd forgotten. Stone walls draped in ivy, warm light glowing from tall windows. My father's name etched into the iron gate. For the first time in years, I felt something like safety. Mr. Langston met me in the foyer. He looked older than I remembered, but his presence felt steady, familiar, like a bridge back to something I'd almost forgotten. "Your father built this place for peace," he told me softly. "He wanted you to have it when the world tried to strip you of who you are." I swallowed hard. I don't even know who I am anymore. He nodded, calm. "Then this is where you'll find her again." Room by room, I walked the house with Naomi resting against my shoulder. It didn't feel like wealth. It felt like safety. The kitchen windows welcomed the morning sun. The nursery stood untouched, as though someone had been waiting for her. My father's study overflowed with books, the margins lined with his careful notes. That night, I read until my eyes blurred. Naomi slept deeply for the first time in days, and for once, I let myself cry. Not from grief, but from relief. The house didn't magically heal me, but it gave me something I hadn't known in months. Stillness. Security. A door that locked without fear. Every morning, I wandered barefoot through the garden, Naomi bundled in my arms, the dew soaking my pajama hems. It wasn't about beauty, it was about breathing again, about remembering I was alive. Mr. Langston visited often, always carrying folders. At first, I barely looked at the papers. Trusts, business dealings, real estate, board seats. He never pressured me. Take your time, he'd say. But remember, your father didn't leave you a fortress to hide in. He left you a foundation to stand on. Those words stirred something inside me. Not pride. Not even anger. Purpose. I started reading. Page by page, I pieced together the legacy my father had built. Logistics, community programs, investments, philanthropy. But woven through all of it was something more. Integrity. He hadn't built just wealth. He'd built a legacy of principle. And now it was mine. I joined the foundation's board first, quietly. Most assumed I'd just smile for photos and cut ribbons. I let them believe it. Then I started asking questions. I rewrote grant priorities. I redirected funds, women's shelters, housing for single mothers, therapy programs, child care stipends. The resistance was subtle but present, raised brows, muttered doubts. But every shift worked. Impact grew. Reports showed progress. Donations increased. Lives were being changed. And I did it all with Naomi in my lap. Then came the corporate board, the logistics company my father had built. A room full of men in suits who barely remembered my name. They expected timidity. What they got was steel. I walked in prepared, clear, calm. I didn't posture. I didn't yell. I simply spoke with the quiet certainty my father once carried. I didn't demand respect. I built something so undeniable, they had no choice but to listen. At home, Naomi flourished. She laughed more, asked endless questions. We painted the hallway with little handprints, burned cookies in the oven, filled the estate with noise and love. She didn't know we were rebuilding an empire. She only knew we were safe. And I no longer whispered to myself to be brave. I was brave. I was back. And the world would soon see the woman they thought they'd erased. The ballroom shimmered with chandeliers and polished glass, sequined gowns reflecting light in every direction. The kind of luxury meant to impress. But I didn't feel small. Not anymore. Tonight, the Brooks Foundation was hosting its first gala under my leadership. My name, Danielle Brooks, hung on banners, printed on invitations, whispered in conversations across the room. It had been nearly 3 years since that freezing night when I was pushed into the darkness with a newborn in my arms and nowhere to go. Tonight, I entered on my own terms, Naomi's small hand tucked in mine. She wore a pale blue dress with a matching bow, her curls bouncing as she pointed at the glittering lights. I had debated bringing her, but in the end, this night belonged to her too. I felt them before I saw them. The shift in the room that comes with unfinished stories. Terence and Claudine. They hadn't been invited. Likely they slipped in through a business contact, unaware of who was hosting. When our eyes met, I saw it instantly. The unraveling. Terence's mouth opened, then closed again. Claudine stiffened, for once speechless. I didn't stop. I didn't slow. I held Naomi's hand tighter and smiled as we walked past them. Not a smirk, not triumph, just peace. Because I no longer needed their apologies to know I had one. Later, standing at the podium, the lights warming my face, the audience leaned in. I didn't mention Terence or Claudine. I spoke instead of resilience, of rebuilding, of carrying both a child and your dignity through fire and refusing to let either go. The applause thundered. I caught sight of them at the edge of the crowd, no longer powerful, no longer feared, just part of the audience. They looked at me as though they didn't recognize me. And they were right. The girl they had discarded was gone. In her place stood a woman they could never break. The path behind the estate was quiet, the kind of quiet that sinks into your bones. Leaves crackled beneath Naomi's boots as her hand swung gently in mine. She was 5 now, curious, forever asking questions. In her free hand, she carried a fistful of wildflowers. "These are for Grandpa," she said solemnly. We reached the stone marker beneath a wide oak tree, my father's name etched deep into the granite. Naomi knelt, placing the flowers with care. "Did he really love you?" she asked. "Yes," I whispered, my throat tight. "He loved me in the kind of way that doesn't always use words, but strong like roots." She looked up. "Did he help us when Daddy and Grandma were mean?" I nodded. "He gave us more than protection. He gave us a legacy, a way to rise." We sat together, backs against the cool bark of the tree, the wind brushing Naomi's hair across her face. I tucked the strands behind her ear and stared at the sky. I thought of everything. The motel nights, the boardroom battles, the moment I walked past Terence and Claudine as if they were strangers. I didn't regret the silence I'd kept, the distance I'd chosen. Some wounds don't deserve reopening. Some people don't deserve another chance. I built a life without them. I no longer waited for updates. I no longer flinched at their names. From others I'd heard about Terence's troubles, about Claudine's fading health. They were slipping into irrelevance. And I felt nothing. My world was full now, of bedtime stories and burnt pancakes, of meetings and signed contracts, of little shoes in the hallway and loud laughter in the kitchen. I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving. And Naomi, she would grow up knowing what strength truly looked like. Not the loud kind, but the steady kind. The kind that rebuilds. The kind that plants. I glanced at my father's grave. "They thought they buried me," I whispered. "But they didn't know I was a seed. And now I've bloomed." When they closed the door on me, they thought it was the end of my story. What they didn't realize was that it was only the beginning. I wasn't buried. I was planted. And with every step, every choice, every victory, I grew into something stronger than they could have ever imagined. Today, I stand not as the woman they discarded, but as the woman who bloomed from the ashes of betrayal. And this is the life they could never take away.